14 ships turned around in 72 hours. That is not a blockade announcement. That is the United States Navy physically rewriting the rules of this war without firing a single shot. While diplomatic channels buzzed and ceasefire talks stumbled forward in Islamabad, something far more decisive was happening on the water. The U.S. just shut down Iran's entire coastline. Every port, every cargo route, every tanker trying to move Iranian oil out of the Persian Gulf stopped cold. And that's not even the biggest story today, because while the U.S. Navy was locking down Hormuz, Israel quietly secured something it has been fighting toward for weeks, a 10-day ceasefire with Lebanon. Two fronts, simultaneously, controlled. But here's what nobody is reporting: the mechanism Iran still holds, the one card that could unravel everything Washington just built. We'll get to that. Stay with us. To understand what's happening at Hormuz right now, you need to go back to Monday, April 13th, 10 a.m. Eastern Time. That's the moment CENTCOM's blockade formally activates, not as a warning, not as a threat, but as an operational fact. Guided missile destroyers take position. Over 100 U.S. aircraft, surveillance, fighter, maritime patrol begin continuous rotations above the Persian Gulf and the Sea of Oman. More than 10,000 American military personnel are now enforcing a perimeter around Iran's coastline that no commercial vessel can cross without U.S. authorization. The scope is precise. This is not a blockade of the Strait of Hormuz itself. That would be an act of war against global shipping. This targets something narrower and more surgical: any vessel entering or departing an Iranian port. The legal framing matters because it lets Washington maintain international legitimacy while maximizing economic pain on Tehran. And the pain is immediate. Economic trade by sea into and out of Iran completely halted. That's CENTCOM's own language. Completely. 14 vessels attempt compliance routes in the first 72 hours. 14 turn around. Not one gets through to an Iranian port. But here's what the briefings glossed over: the specific vulnerability this blockade creates inside Iran that goes far beyond oil revenues. What it means for the 85 million people living inside those borders, and why the IRGC's response, when it came, revealed more than Tehran intended. A guided missile destroyer is not a passive vessel. Each one carries a crew of over 300 sailors, operates across a combat radius measured in hundreds of nautical miles, and carries enough firepower to simultaneously engage air, surface, and subsurface threats. These are not Coast Guard cutters. These are the instruments of American hard power projection, and right now more than a dozen of them are operating in a coordinated enforcement architecture around Iran's coast. The mechanics work like this. Any vessel approaching an Iranian port receives a radio challenge from U.S. forces. The challenge is not a request. It is an instruction: turn around or face boarding. No vessel in the first 72 hours tests the second option. All 14 comply. They reverse course. They return to international waters. Their cargo, grain, manufactured goods, industrial equipment, fuel inputs, stays out of Iran. Over 100 U.S. aircraft provide the eyes. Surveillance platforms track vessel positions in real time. Fighter coverage guarantees that any Iranian naval response would be met immediately. The system is layered, redundant, and, so far, functioning exactly as designed. CENTCOM Admiral Brad Cooper describes his forces as focused, vigilant, and highly motivated. That phrasing is deliberate. It signals to Tehran that this is not a rotation of reluctant conscripts. These are professionals executing a mission they trained for. Defense Secretary Hegseth goes further. The U.S. military, he states publicly, is locked and loaded, ready to transition from blockade enforcement to, in his words, major combat operations if Iran does not comply. That is not diplomatic language. That is a direct military ultimatum delivered through a press conference. But the real pressure Iran faces, the one that goes deeper than oil revenues and shipping lanes, is something the mainstream coverage keeps missing entirely. Iran is not powerless here. Let's be direct about that. The IRGC Navy has operated in the Persian Gulf for decades. They know these waters with an intimacy no foreign fleet can fully replicate. They have fast attack boats, submarine assets, anti-ship missile batteries positioned along Iran's coastline, weapons specifically designed to threaten exactly the kind of surface vessels the U.S. is deploying. Their Noor anti-ship missile, based on Chinese C-802 technology, has a range of 170 kilometers and can be launched from mobile coastal platforms that are difficult to locate and preemptively destroy. Iran's doctrine is asymmetric by design. The IRGC does not try to match U.S. naval tonnage. It tries to make the cost of engagement too high. Swarm tactics, mines, shore-based missile systems. It's a doctrine that worried U.S. naval planners for years, and for good reason. And Iran still holds its most powerful geographic card, the Strait of Hormuz. At its narrowest point, just 33 kilometers wide. Roughly 20% of the world's oil and liquefied natural gas moves through it. Iran does not need to sink a destroyer to cause a global crisis. It needs only to credibly threaten the strait, and tanker insurance rates spike, shipping companies reroute, markets convulse. But, and this is the critical part, the blockade architecture Washington has built is specifically designed to absorb that threat. The mine clearance mission that began April 11th with USS Frank E. Peterson and USS Michael Murphy is not defensive housekeeping. It's proactive lane clearing. It signals that the U.S. anticipated Iranian mining and prepared the counter before the move was made. Iran's deterrent is real, but so far, it hasn't been enough to stop 14 ships from turning around. Here is what completely halted actually means on the ground. Iran's economy runs on hydrocarbon exports. Oil, natural gas, petrochemical products. They move by sea. When the sea closes, the revenue stops, not slows. Stops. The $270 billion damage estimate Iranian officials released this week, that number covers weeks of strikes on infrastructure. But the blockade threatens something different. The ongoing income stream that funds everything else, military salaries, subsidy programs, the social contracts that keep Iranian cities from fracturing. In the port city of Bandar Abbas, Iran's most critical commercial gateway, sitting directly at the mouth of Hormuz, dock workers are watching cargo queues freeze. Ships that would normally carry refined products outbound sit anchored. Ships that would bring in industrial inputs are held at distance. The supply chain doesn't break all at once. It slows. Then it stops. Then the pressure moves inland. That's not a distant geopolitical abstraction. That's a family in Tehran paying more for a kilogram of chicken this week than last week, not knowing exactly why, only knowing that something has shifted. The global implication of that pressure is this. The blockade converts U.S. naval dominance into internal Iranian political stress. It doesn't just hurt the economy. It creates domestic political tension between the IRGC hardliners demanding defiance and the pragmatists who understand what a sustained blockade means for social stability. And that tension, right now, is exactly where Washington wants Iran to be. Now, the thing the briefings kept quiet. Iran's shipping doesn't all move under an Iranian flag. That's the part of this blockade story that mainstream coverage flattens. Iranian-linked cargo has moved for years through a network of vessels registered in Malta, Panama, the Marshall Islands, flags of convenience that obscure beneficial ownership. The sanctioned tanker Rich Starry, for example, was registered outside Iran when it attempted to transit Hormuz. The U.S. blockade, as officially defined, targets vessels entering or departing Iranian ports, not vessels by Iranian ownership or registry. That creates a gap. And Iranian logistics networks, practiced at sanctions evasion after years of pressure, know that gap exists. CENTCOM says 14 vessels turned around. Independent shipping trackers tell a more complicated story. Some Iran-linked vessels appear to have crossed the strait itself, not to Iranian ports, but moving cargo through alternative routing. Let that sit for a moment. Because what it means is this: the blockade is not airtight. It is highly effective, but it is not hermetic. And the IRGC, sources familiar with Iranian maritime doctrine confirm, has been planning for exactly this scenario. The strategy isn't to break through the blockade. It's to route around it, slowly, partially, enough to maintain minimum economic function while the diplomatic track plays out. That's not Iranian weakness. That's Iranian patience, holding the line not by force, but by navigation. Every tanker captain operating anywhere near the Persian Gulf made the same calculation this week. Do I risk a U.S. radio challenge? Do I reroute through alternative lanes and absorb the extra cost? Do I hold position in international waters and wait? Most chose to wait. Shipping through Hormuz is down 95% from pre-war levels. That number travels instantly to energy markets, to insurance underwriters in London, to refinery procurement managers in South Korea and Japan who built their entire planning assumptions around Persian Gulf supply. Oil prices have been volatile, not crashing, not spiking, sitting in that uncomfortable range where markets can't price the risk because they can't read the timeline. The S&P 500 hit record highs this week as investors bet on a diplomatic resolution. But those same investors are watching Hormuz with one eye and Islamabad with the other. China, which receives a significant portion of Iran's oil through sanctioned channels, has publicly condemned the blockade as reckless. Beijing urged restoration of navigation freedom in the Strait. That condemnation carries weight, not because China is about to intervene militarily, but because Chinese demand was one of the pressure release valves that kept Iranian oil revenues flowing under previous sanctions. If the blockade squeezes that channel too, Tehran's options narrow further. Pakistan's army chief is in Tehran right now, literally today. Trying to bridge a nuclear gap that neither side has publicly closed, Iran insisting enrichment rights are sovereign, Washington insisting on verification and duration limits that Tehran hasn't accepted. And then there's Lebanon, a 10-day ceasefire announced today at 5 p.m. Eastern. Israel and Lebanon, silent. The Northern Front, paused. What happens when that 10-day clock runs out? Nobody has answered that yet. There is something that gets lost when we talk about blockades and destroyers and shipping data. Behind every vessel that turned around this week, behind every cargo queue frozen at Bandar Abbas, behind every CENTCOM press statement, there are 85 million people inside Iran who did not choose this war and cannot opt out of its consequences. There are families in southern Lebanon who watched a ceasefire get announced today and felt something cautious, something fragile, not quite hope, because they have felt hope before and watched it expire. And there is Gaza, still there, still burning in ways that the Hormuz coverage displaces from the front page but cannot displace from the consciousness of the hundreds of millions of people watching this conflict from Indonesia, from Malaysia, from Nigeria, from Colombia. People for whom Palestine is not a geopolitical abstraction, but a moral wound that has been open for decades. The hospitals, the schools, the documented civilian infrastructure that keeps getting described as collateral by the same institutions that also claim precision and proportionality. At some point, and this is not opinion, this is the consensus of international humanitarian law. At some point, the accounting must happen. The ledger must be read. The world that is watching this conflict is not the world of 1991 or 2003. Information moves differently. Footage moves differently. The grandmother in Tehran and the student in Jakarta and the dock worker in Karachi are watching the same live feed. They are drawing the same conclusions. Enough. That word keeps appearing. In streets, in comment sections, in the quiet conversations that don't make news, but that shape what comes next. Enough. The question this conflict has never answered, and still hasn't, is what comes after enough. 3 things we do not know. We do not know what Iran gave up or refused to give up in the Islamabad talks that collapsed. The nuclear gap between a 20-year suspension Washington wants and the 3 to 5 years Tehran offered is not just a number. It is the entire strategic question of this war. And that gap has not closed. We do not know whether the Lebanon ceasefire holds past 10 days. Hezbollah has not formally confirmed the terms, the IRGC has not confirmed the terms, and Israel has continued operations in southern Lebanon within the same 24-hour window that ceasefire was announced. We do not know what happens if one vessel attempts to break the blockade and U.S. forces respond with something more than a radio challenge. What we know is this. The Strait of Hormuz is the narrowest point between a war and the rest of the world's economy. The U.S. Navy is holding one side of it, Iran is holding the other. And somewhere between those positions, in Islamabad, in Tehran, in back channels that haven't made the news yet, the conversation that actually ends this is still unfinished. When it breaks one way or the other, it will break fast. The next 72 hours may tell us which direction.